The six of them stood at the edge of the dense, unforgiving forest, each with their own reasons for being there, each carrying their own expectations. Some were driven by curiosity, others by ambition, but none of them were prepared for what awaited them. Dr. Jonathan Mercer had spent the last 15 years chasing legends. He wasn't just a believer, he was obsessed. While others laughed at the idea of Bigfoot, he dedicated his career to proving its existence. Skeptics called him a fool, but he had something they didn't: evidence. Strange footprints, unidentified vocalizations, a growing number of disappearances that couldn't be explained. This was his chance. A remote mountain range, a history of strange occurrences, and a handful of locals too terrified to go near the area. He was convinced they were close, closer than anyone had ever been. Daniel Lowe wasn't like the others. He had grown up near these woods, hearing stories passed down from generations. Stories that weren't just myths, they were warnings. The elders spoke of an ancient being that roamed the mountains, a guardian of the land that didn't take kindly to trespassers. He had agreed to lead the expedition, but not because he wanted to. There was something wrong about this place. He could feel it in his bones. The trees stood too still. The silence ran too deep. The others thought they were chasing a legend. Daniel knew better. Lisa Carter didn't believe in monsters. She believed in stories, and she knew a damn good one when she saw it. If there was even a shred of truth to the Bigfoot rumors, this could be her ticket to something bigger. A documentary, a best-selling book, maybe even national news. She was ready to expose the truth, whatever that truth was. Either they'd find undeniable evidence, or she'd debunk the myth once and for all. Either way, she'd be the one telling the world about it. Mark Evans had filmed everything from war zones to underground fight clubs. He didn't scare easily. To him, this was just another job, point, shoot, document. If they found anything interesting, great. If not, he'd still walk away with a paycheck. But he had seen Lisa's research. Strange lights, shadowy figures, survivors who refused to speak about what they'd seen. The footage from past expeditions always cut off too soon, ending in static or screams. Mark wasn't a superstitious guy, but something about this job felt different. Chris and Jake weren't scientists. They weren't reporters. They were thrill seekers, adrenaline junkies who lived for the next great adventure. Climbing mountains, diving into caves, walking through abandoned asylums at night. It was all just a game to them. Bigfoot, just another ghost story. But if there was even a slight chance they could be the first to see it, to capture real proof, that would be legendary. They weren't afraid. They should have been. Over the past year, hikers had vanished without a trace. Campers were found torn apart in ways no known animal could have done. Park rangers refused to go near certain areas. Something was out there. Mercer had gathered the best team he could. A mix of science, experience, and pure recklessness. They had cameras, tracking devices, and enough supplies to last a week in the wilderness. The plan was simple: hike deep into the restricted zone, gather evidence, and make history. They had no idea that history was about to swallow them whole. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, pressing down on them like an unseen weight. The usual sounds of the wilderness, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, began to fade. In their place was something far more unsettling. Silence. A silence so thick it felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lisa was the first to notice. She stopped mid-step, her gaze darting to the trees around them. "Do you feel that?" she muttered, barely above a whisper. Mark adjusted the strap of his camera bag. "Feel what?" She hesitated, like we're being watched. No one laughed, not even Chris or Jake, who had spent most of the hike cracking jokes at Mercer's expense. Because the truth was, they all felt it. A presence lurking just beyond their vision, hovering at the edges of their senses. Then came the smell. It hit them all at once, thick and putrid. a foul stench of decay that clung to the air. Chris gagged, pulling his shirt up over his nose. Jesus, what the hell is that? Daniel had gone rigid, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. Without a word, he stepped off the trail, following the scent through the trees. The others exchanged uneasy glances before trailing after him. The sight stopped them cold. Scattered across the forest floor were the remains of an animal, at least what was left of one. Bones jutted out from torn flesh, organs spilled onto the dirt like something had been ripped apart rather than eaten. Deep claw marks ran along the exposed ribcage, the cuts too precise, too deliberate for any predator they knew. Mercer crouched beside it, studying the wounds with grim fascination. This isn't normal. No shit, Jake muttered. Lisa pulled out her camera, but before she could hit record, Daniel grabbed her wrist. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Don't. She frowned. Why not? He shook his head. It's not fresh. Lisa glanced back at the carcass. Flies buzzed around it, the meat still red and raw. It looks fresh to me. Daniel swallowed. That's the problem. Before anyone could press him further, Mark let out a low whistle. Guys, you might want to see this. He was standing by a tree, running his fingers over the bark. When they got closer, they saw what had caught his attention. Deep, jagged markings carved into the trunk. Not by a knife, not by an axe, by something with claws. The grooves were huge, spaced apart like the hand of a massive creature. Some ran horizontally, others in strange patterns that didn't resemble any language but still carried a chilling intent. A warning. Daniel took a shaky step back. We need to turn around, he said. Mercer barely looked up from the markings. We came all this way. We're not leaving now. Daniel's jaw tightened. You don't understand. His voice was lower now, urgent. We shouldn't be here. Chris scoffed. Come on, man. It's probably just a bear. Daniel turned to him, eyes dark. Then tell me, what kind of bear writes? For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mercer stood, brushing dirt off his hands. We keep moving. His tone left no room for argument. Daniel exhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. Not because he agreed, but because he knew it was already too late. The fire crackled weakly in the center of their camp, casting flickering shadows against the trees. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. No one spoke. Even Chris and Jake, who had been the loudest all day, sat quietly, their eyes scanning the treeline. Something about this place gnawed at them, an unshakable feeling that they weren't alone. Mark adjusted his camera, flipping it to night vision. The eerie green glow of the screen illuminated the others' faces, drained of warmth, their expressions tight with unease. He panned it across the treeline, pausing as something moved. A hollow knock echoed from deep in the woods. Then another, and another. Lisa sat up straighter. What was that? No one answered. The sound came again, a rhythmic knocking like something hard striking against wood. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, patterned. Daniel's face had gone pale. It knows we're here. Mercer leaned forward, intrigued. It? Daniel swallowed. His voice was barely above a whisper. That's how they communicate. A low growl rumbled through the trees. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something deeper, something that sent a primal chill through their bones. Chris stood abruptly, gripping the small hunting knife strapped to his belt. All right, I've had enough of this. He grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on and pointing it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only tangled branches and empty space. Mark lifted his camera again, the night vision cutting through the blackness in a way the human eye couldn't. His breath caught. Two glowing orbs hovered in the distance. Eyes. They were high off the ground, too high for any normal creature. Mark's fingers tightened on the camera as he whispered, "I see something." Chris swung the flashlight toward where Mark was looking. The light sliced through the trees, but there was nothing there. Mark blinked. The eyes were gone, but he had seen them. He knew he had seen them. Lisa turned to Mercer. "What if it doesn't want us here?" Before he could answer, something shifted in the air. A strange sensation crawled up their spines, like an unseen force pressing against their minds. And then, "Jake!" The voice was quiet, almost gentle. It came from the trees just beyond their camp. Jake froze. Who said that? No one had. Then it came again, a little closer this time. "Jake!" A breathless whisper, mimicking a voice that wasn't there. It was familiar, too familiar. Jake scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in confusion and fear. "What the hell is this? Who's messing with me?" Lisa's hands were trembling. "We need to leave, now." Daniel took a slow step back toward the fire, his voice shaking. "It's not just a creature." He looked at Mercer, his eyes pleading. "It's not just muscle and teeth. It gets inside your head." A branch snapped. Something big was moving in the darkness. Then silence. They weren't alone, and whatever was out there was watching. The scream tore through the silence like a blade. Sharp, raw, filled with terror. Lisa jolted awake, heart pounding against her ribs. The others were already scrambling out of their tents, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The scream had come from Jake's tent. "Jake!" Chris called, voice tight with panic. No answer. Mark raised his camera, the green glow of night vision illuminating the scene as they rushed toward the tent. The fabric was ripped open from the inside, the nylon shredded like paper. The flashlight beam landed on the ground. Blood, a lot of it. And something else. A severed hand lay in the dirt just outside the entrance, fingers still curled around the zipper, as if Jake had been dragged out mid-motion. The nails were cracked, the skin torn where he had clawed at the fabric, fighting to hold on. Chris staggered back, gagging. Lisa covered her mouth, eyes wide in horror. Mark's grip tightened on the camera. He swallowed hard and turned the lens toward the tree-line, his instincts screaming that they weren't alone. The screen flickered. A shadow. It was there for a fraction of a second, standing just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Tall, too tall, broad shoulders, a hunched posture, eyes burning red in the darkness. And then it was gone. "Where the hell is he?" Chris shouted, frantic. Lisa's breath hitched. "We need to go after him." Daniel was shaking his head, his face pale as death. "He's gone." Mercer turned on him. "We don't know that." Daniel's eyes darted to the trees, to the dark void that had swallowed Jake whole. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, we do." Something deep in the forest let out a low, guttural growl. And then, from somewhere far too close, a voice, distorted, wrong, whispered, "Jake." It wasn't a name anymore. It was a warning. Chris was the first to run. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't strategy. It was pure survival instinct. The others weren't far behind. Lisa barely had time to grab her bag before she sprinted after him, her breath ragged, heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The forest blurred around them, trees stretching like skeletal fingers in the dark. Mark kept his camera rolling even as he stumbled over roots and rocks. Something was behind them. He didn't need to turn around to know it. He could feel it, that primal, gut-wrenching certainty that they were prey. Mercer was yelling something, but the words were lost beneath the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, keeping pace with them far too easily. Then Chris skidded to a stop. What the hell? Lisa nearly slammed into his back. Then she saw it too. Dirt, stamped down, smashed branches, a circle of massive footprints surrounding their camp. They had never been alone. They had been trapped from the start. A wet, guttural exhale sent a wave of heat down Lisa's neck. The stench of rot filled her lungs. It was right behind them. Mark turned, the night vision flickering as he raised his camera. His screen went static for a second, then refocused just in time to capture something enormous emerging from the shadows. A hand, if it could even be called that. Thick, gnarled fingers, covered in dark, matted fur. Mottled skin stretched over unnatural muscle, and claws jagged and long enough to slice through bone. Before he could react, before he could even scream, a blur of movement snapped forward. There was a sickening crack. Mark's body went rigid. His head twisted at an impossible angle, his eyes still frozen wide in horror. Then his lifeless body collapsed to the ground. Lisa choked back a scream, her legs locked in place as she watched something pull Mark's corpse into the darkness. So fast, so effortless, it was as if he had never been there at all. Mercer grabbed her arm. Run! Daniel was already gone. Chris was panting, eyes wild. Where's Jake? Where's Mark? Something moved in the trees. Tall, wrong, waiting. Then came the sound. A sickening, wet tearing. Chris spun toward the noise, just in time to see a figure yanked backwards into the black. He barely had time to cry out before the night swallowed him whole. Lisa clamped a hand over her mouth, trembling, tears burning her eyes. Mercer tightened his grip on her wrist. Don't look, just run. And so they did. But the forest had already decided. They weren't getting out. Lisa, Mercer, and Daniel ran until their lungs burned, until their legs threatened to give out beneath them. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, suffocating, impossible to escape. The air was thick with the stench of blood and rot, and somewhere behind them, it was still following. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath them vanished. Lisa barely had time to scream before she tumbled forward, crashing into loose dirt and jagged rocks. Mercer hit the ground hard beside her, rolling to a stop with a painful grunt. Daniel landed last, his camera slamming against stone before bouncing away into the shadows. Silence. Lisa blinked, disoriented, her hands pressing into something brittle. She looked down and immediately wished she hadn't. Bones. Scattered across the cavern floor, not just animal bones, human, skulls cracked open like eggshells, rib cages caved in, spines twisted and snapped like dry twigs. The stench of decay was overwhelming. Daniel groaned, pushing himself up. He caught sight of the remains, and his face drained of color. "Oh God," he whispered. Mercer was already scrambling to his feet. His voice was urgent, shaking. "We need to move, now." Then, from the darkness came a sound. Drip. Lisa's breath hitched. The ceiling, it was wet. Something thick and dark oozed down the rock walls. Blood. and then movement. A shadow shifted at the far end of the cave, deep in the blackness where their flashlights couldn't reach. Lisa's stomach twisted. She could hear it, breathing, heavy, wet, right there. Daniel fumbled for his camera, hands shaking as he lifted it to his face. The night vision flickered to life, casting the screen in sickly green. He swept it across the cavern, past the bones, past the walls, eyes glowing, red, watching them. Then something lunged. Daniel didn't even have time to scream before a massive hand clamped around his ankle and ripped him backward into the dark. Lisa shrieked, grabbing for him, but Mercer yanked her away. No and oh. Daniel's screams turned raw, panicked, then cut off. What followed was worse. A sound wet and unnatural, the unmistakable crunch of teeth sinking into flesh, the slow, deliberate tearing of muscle from bone. The camera had fallen sideways, still recording. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. A face not human. The eyes burned red, locked onto the camera like it knew it was being watched. Its mouth was slick with blood, teeth jagged and too many, lips curled into something almost like a grin. Lisa couldn't breathe. Then it moved toward them. Lisa ran. She didn't know how long, didn't know in which direction, only that she had to get away. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed for mercy, but she didn't stop. The cave, the blood, the thing that had taken Daniel. It was all behind her now, but the terror had its claws in her mind, refusing to let go. Mercer had been right beside her. Had been. Somewhere along the way, she heard him scream, heard something heavy tackle him to the ground. She hadn't looked back. She couldn't. Now she was alone. The trees thinned, the ground sloping upward. Her foot caught on a rock, sending her stumbling forward, and when she finally looked up, her stomach dropped. The edge of the cliff loomed ahead, a sheer drop into blackness. Lisa spun around, chest heaving, heart hammering against her ribs. The forest behind her was deathly still, the trees standing like silent witnesses. But she knew. It was here. The air changed. A deep, rumbling vibration crawled through the ground, through her bones, and then it stepped into the moonlight. Bigfoot. Not a blurry shape in the distance. Not a hoax, not a myth. Real. It was bigger than she could comprehend, towering over her at nearly 3 meters tall. Its broad shoulders and thick fur were matted with mud and something darker. Its chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, intelligent eyes locked onto her, studying. Not an animal, not a mindless beast. Something ancient, something that had seen intruders before. Lisa backed away, her heels slipping on the loose dirt at the cliff's edge. Nowhere left to run. Bigfoot raised a hand, fingers curling into a massive fist. It wasn't just going to kill her. It was going to erase her like it had erased the others. Then, a sound tore through the night. Not human, not animal. A howl, low, guttural, alien, rolled across the treetops, shaking the very air around them. Lisa felt it inside her skull, reverberating deep in her chest. It wasn't coming from Bigfoot. It was coming from somewhere beyond the trees. Bigfoot froze. For the first time, Lisa saw something flicker across its face. Hesitation. Then slowly it lowered its hand. It didn't look at her anymore, its head tilted slightly, listening. After a long moment, it took a step back, then another. Lisa couldn't move, couldn't think. She just watched as the creature disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the night. But before it left, Before its glowing eyes faded from view, it paused. A warning. Don't come back. Lisa's vision blurred. Her body gave out, knees buckling beneath her. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the endless abyss below. Lisa woke to the sound of beeping. Sharp, steady, rhythmic. The harsh glow of fluorescent lights burned her eyes as she blinked against the sterile white ceiling. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as she shifted. There was a dull throbbing at the back of her skull, the taste of iron on her tongue. She was alive. A nurse appeared beside her, calling for a doctor. The room spun as Lisa tried to sit up, panic surging through her veins. The others, she rasped, throat dry, voice barely more than a whisper. Where are the others? The nurse didn't answer. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions. Doctors, police officers, officials in suits. They spoke to her in calm, measured tones, carefully choosing their words. They told her she was found at the base of the cliff, unconscious but breathing, that she had been out there for 2 days before a rescue team discovered her, that she was the only one left. Lisa told them the truth. She told them about the night in the woods, about the eyes watching them from the trees, about the thing that had taken Daniel, that had torn Mark apart like he was nothing. She told them about the cave, the bones, the creature that had stared straight into the camera. And finally, she told them about Bigfoot. The doctors exchanged looks. The officers scribbled notes. Some nodded, but their faces gave them away. They didn't believe her. We found no evidence of anything unusual, one officer finally said. No bodies, no footprints. Lisa's stomach churned. That's not possible. They told her they searched the area. The campsite was destroyed, but there was no blood, no bodies, no signs that anyone had ever been there at all. And then came the worst part. The camera was missing. All the footage gone. All except one recording. A single audio file recovered from Mark's equipment, corrupted beyond repair. No video, just sound. Lisa listened. At first, it was nothing but the rustling of leaves, the crunch of footsteps, then breathing, labored, panicked, desperate. Then a scream. Mark's voice, raw and terrified, cut off so suddenly it sent a chill through her bones. Silence followed. Then, faintly, a sound from deep within the static. A voice. Low, guttural, not human. It spoke in a language Lisa didn't recognize, the syllables thick and ancient, carrying something terribly old and terribly knowing. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. A warning. The recording ended in a deep, wet exhale, like something massive had been standing just behind the microphone. The officers dismissed it as interference, the remnants of a corrupted file. Lisa knew better. She sat in that hospital bed, staring at them, knowing that nothing she said would ever matter, knowing that the truth was out there, buried beneath the trees, beneath the silence, beneath the legend. Bigfoot wasn't just a story, it was a warning. And no one would listen.